Breonna Taylor was not a headline when she woke up each morning. She was not a symbol, not a hashtag, not a political debate. She was a 26-year-old black woman living in Louisville, Kentucky, building a quiet but meaningful life. She worked as an emergency medical technician and EMT, someone who answered 911 calls, someone who helped strangers breathe again, someone who ran toward danger when others ran away. Her job was to save lives. Ironically, her own life would later be taken in a moment filled with chaos, fear, and irreversible mistakes. Breonna dreamed of becoming a nurse. She talked about it often with her family and friends. She liked normal things, watching TV, laughing with loved ones, planning a future that felt stable and earned. To those who knew her, she was caring, soft-spoken, and responsible. To her mother, Tamika Palmer, she was everything. A daughter who checked in, who cared deeply, who believed that doing the right thing mattered. On the night of March 12, 2020, Breonna was at home. It was late. The world outside was quiet, the kind of silence that only comes after midnight. She was with her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker. Nothing about that night suggested danger. No warning. No sirens. No reason to believe that her life was about to change forever. What Breonna didn't know, what she could not possibly have known, was that plainclothes police officers were on their way to her apartment with a search warrant. A warrant tied to a drug investigation involving someone who did not live with her and was already in police custody elsewhere. Yet her address was still listed. A decision that would prove fatal. The officers claimed they knocked and announced themselves. Kenneth Walker said they did not. Neighbors later confirmed they heard loud banging but did not hear police identify themselves. In the darkness, confused and afraid, Kenneth believed someone was breaking in. When the door was forced open, he fired one warning shot, thinking he was protecting his home. That single moment triggered a storm of gunfire. Police fired more than 30 rounds into the apartment. Breonna Taylor was hit multiple times. She collapsed in her own hallway. She never got medical help in time. The woman who spent her life saving others was left bleeding on the floor. She died at the scene. At first, the public barely heard about Breonna. Her death did not immediately lead to arrests or charges. The police report initially claimed there were no injuries. For weeks, her name stayed in the shadows. But her family did not stay silent. Her mother demanded answers. Activists began asking questions. Journalists started digging. And slowly, the truth emerged. Breonna had no criminal record. No drugs were found in her apartment. The person police were searching for was already detained miles away. The justification for the raid began to crumble under scrutiny. The more people learned, the more uncomfortable the story became. Why was a no-knock warrant approved? Why was it executed so late at night? Why were plainclothes officers sent? Why was Breonna's life treated as acceptable collateral damage? As protests erupted across the United States in 2020 following the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor's name rose alongside others. Say her name became more than a slogan, it became a demand. People realized that black women, too, were victims of systemic violence, often erased from the conversation. Murals of Breonna appeared on walls. Her face was printed on posters. Her smile became a symbol of stolen futures. Celebrities, athletes, and politicians spoke her name. But behind all of it was a grieving mother who simply wanted justice for her child. The city of Louisville eventually paid a civil settlement of $12 million to Breonna's family, the largest in the city's history, and agreed to police reforms. But money was not justice. Reforms were not accountability. The officers who fired the shots were not charged for Breonna's death. Only one officer was later charged for endangering neighbors due to bullets entering nearby apartments. Not for killing Breonna Taylor. For many, this felt like another betrayal. Another reminder that justice in America often feels conditional, selective, incomplete. Breonna Taylor became a question the system could not easily answer. If a woman can die in her own home, doing nothing wrong, and still not receive justice, then who is truly safe? This chapter is not just the beginning of Breonna's story. It is the beginning of a global awakening. A realization that justice delayed, denied, or diluted is not justice at all. And that remembering Breonna is not about the night she died but about the life she lived, and the accountability the world still owes her. Breonna Taylor's death might have remained another buried police report if not for one powerful force: refusal to forget. In the weeks after she was killed, official statements were vague, carefully worded, and painfully cold. Authorities described the raid as lawful. They spoke in passive language. Shots were fired, a suspect was injured, an investigation is ongoing. Breonna's name was barely mentioned. Her humanity was almost entirely erased. But outside the walls of official press conferences, something was changing. Breonna's mother, Tamika Palmer, began speaking publicly. Her voice carried grief, but also clarity. She refused to let her daughter be reduced to a footnote. She gave interviews, stood before cameras, and repeated the same truth again and again. Breonna was asleep in her own home. She did nothing wrong. A mother's pain has a way of cutting through lies, and people started listening. Journalists started asking harder questions. Why was Breonna's apartment included in the warrant? Why did police rely on outdated information? Why did the affidavit claim a suspect was receiving packages at her address when postal inspectors denied this? Each new report chipped away at the official narrative. What once sounded like a tragic accident now looked increasingly like negligence wrapped in authority. Then came the protests. In 2020, the United States was already on edge. The killing of George Floyd ignited nationwide demonstrations against police brutality and systemic racism. Amid chants and raised fists, one name echoed louder each day: Breonna Taylor. Unlike many other cases, hers carried a haunting detail. She was killed in her own bed, in her own home, a place universally understood as a symbol of safety. Protesters filled the streets of Louisville demanding arrests. They stood outside the homes of city officials. They painted murals of Breonna's face on walls, sidewalks, and boarded up buildings. Her image, soft smile, kind eyes, became instantly recognizable. For many, it was unbearable to reconcile that face with the violence she endured. Social media amplified everything. Hashtags like #Justice for Breonna, #Say Her Name, and #Arrest the Cops Who Killed Breonna Taylor spread globally. Millions of people who had never heard of Louisville, Kentucky now knew her story. International news outlets picked it up. Protests were held not just across the U.S., but in cities like London, Toronto, Berlin, and Paris. Breonna Taylor had become a global symbol of injustice. Celebrities joined the call. Athletes wore her name on jerseys. Artists dedicated performances to her. Oprah Winfrey placed billboards across Louisville with one simple question: demand justice for Breonna Taylor. The message was impossible to ignore. The case had moved beyond local jurisdiction. It was now a moral test watched by the world. Under mounting pressure, officials announced investigations. The FBI opened a civil rights inquiry. The city's mayor banned no-knock warrants. Louisville Metro Police Department fired one officer involved in the raid, not for Breonna's death, but for wantonly endangering lives due to reckless gunfire. For many, it felt like a symbolic gesture, not accountability. Then came the grand jury decision. Months after Breonna's killing, Kentucky's Attorney General announced the results. Only one officer was charged, and not for killing Breonna Taylor. The charges related to bullets that entered neighboring apartments. When people realized that no one would be held criminally responsible for her death, anger exploded. Protests intensified. People felt betrayed not just by the police, but by the legal system itself. Demonstrators were arrested. Curfews were enforced. The National Guard was deployed. Once again, the response to public outrage was force, not reflection. The irony was bitter: armed authority confronting unarmed grief. For Western audiences, especially Americans, Breonna's case forced uncomfortable questions into the mainstream. What does justice actually mean? Is it punishment, reform, acknowledgement, or all three? Why do civil settlements replace criminal accountability? Why does the law protect institutions more fiercely than individuals? The $12 million civil settlement announced by the city was historic, but it felt hollow to many. Money could not restore Breonna's life. It could not answer the deeper question: how did this happen, and how do we stop it from happening again? Breonna Taylor's story also highlighted something long ignored. Black women are often erased from conversations about police violence. While male victims frequently dominate headlines, women's stories fade faster, even when the injustice is just as severe. Activists emphasized that saying Breonna's name was not optional, it was necessary. International observers saw Breonna's death as part of a broader pattern. To them, this wasn't just an American issue. It was a warning about unchecked power, militarized policing, and the dangers of dehumanization. Human rights organizations cited her case when discussing police reform and racial bias. Breonna Taylor became more than a victim. She became a mirror reflecting how systems respond when they are challenged. A mirror showing whose lives are prioritized and whose are dismissed. A mirror forcing society to confront the cost of silence. Even as news cycles moved on, Breonna's story did not end. Her name remained painted on streets. Her face remained on posters. Her mother continued to speak. Activists continued to demand federal charges. And millions of people carried her story forward not because it was trending, but because it mattered. Breonna Taylor's story did not end with protests fading from the streets or hashtags slowing down online. In many ways, that was only the beginning. Her name became permanently woven into conversations about justice, policing, and whose lives are truly protected under the law. Long after headlines moved on, the questions her death raised continued to echo unanswered, unresolved, and deeply unsettling. For Breonna's family, especially her mother Tamika Palmer, justice was never about revenge. It was about acknowledgement, accountability, and change. She spoke repeatedly about wanting the truth to be fully recognized, not buried under legal language. A mother should not have to fight the system to prove her child mattered. Yet that fight became her reality. In the years following Breonna's death, her case became a reference point in debates about qualified immunity, no-knock warrants, and police transparency. Laws were discussed, policies reviewed, and reforms promised. Louisville officially banned no-knock warrants, and several other jurisdictions across the United States reconsidered their use. For some, this was progress. For others, it felt like the bare minimum changes written in policy while the deeper culture remained untouched. The federal government later brought civil rights charges against officers involved in the raid, reigniting public attention. For supporters, this represented delayed but meaningful action. For critics, it raised another painful question: why did accountability require years of pressure, protests, and international scrutiny? Why was justice reactive instead of immediate? Breonna Taylor's legacy also reshaped how Western audiences viewed victimhood. She did not fit stereotypes often used to justify violence. She was not armed. She was not committing a crime. She was not resisting arrest. She was a healthcare worker asleep in her home. This stripped away excuses and forced society to confront a brutal reality. Sometimes innocence offers no protection. Her story exposed how systems often protect themselves first. Internal investigations cleared officers. Prosecutors hesitated. Language was softened. Responsibility was diluted. For many Americans and global observers, this pattern felt familiar and dangerous. It suggested that when institutions close ranks, truth becomes negotiable. Yet Breonna's legacy is not only about failure. It is also about resistance. Artists continue to paint her face. Schools teach her story. Activists cite her name when pushing for reform. Her case helped fuel broader movements demanding transparency, body cameras, independent prosecutors, and community oversight. In that sense, Breonna Taylor became a catalyst, an unwilling one for change that might protect others. For Black women in particular, Breonna's story opened long overdue conversations. Historically, their suffering has often been overshadowed, minimized, or ignored. Say her name was not just a slogan, it was a demand to recognize that injustice does not discriminate by gender, and silence is its greatest ally. Breonna's legacy forced the world to look at who is remembered and who is forgotten. Internationally, her case influenced how people viewed American justice. To many outside the U.S., Breonna Taylor symbolized contradictions within a nation that promotes freedom and human rights while struggling to protect its own citizens at home. Her death was cited in human rights discussions, documentaries, and global protests as an example of unchecked authority and systemic inequality. But perhaps the most powerful part of Breonna's legacy lies in something quieter. It lives in the discomfort her story creates. Every time someone asks, "How could this happen?" Every time a policymaker is forced to defend outdated practices. Every time a citizen questions whether the law serves people equally, that discomfort is necessary. It prevents forgetting. It keeps the conversation alive. Justice, in Breonna Taylor's case, remains complicated. Some see partial accountability. Others see a complete failure. What is undeniable, however, is that her life and her death changed the narrative. She turned private grief into public reckoning. She forced a system to answer questions it preferred to avoid. Breonna was never meant to be a symbol. She was meant to live, to become a nurse, to build a future, to laugh, grow old, and be ordinary. The tragedy is not just that she died, it's that her death was preventable. Her name now stands as a warning and a promise. A warning of what happens when power goes unchecked. A promise that silence can be broken. For Western audiences, Breonna Taylor's story is not about one city or one police department. It is about values. About whether justice is conditional. About whether institutions serve the people or protect themselves. And about whether society is willing to confront uncomfortable truths rather than bury them. Breonna Taylor mattered. Not because she became famous after death. Not because her name was chanted in protests. But because she was human, and that should have been enough. Her legacy challenges the world to do better. To question more. To accept nothing less than accountability. And until true justice exists not just in law, but in practice, Breonna Taylor's story will continue to be told. Not as history, but as a responsibility.